Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight, Sablewind Pier disappears beneath a blanket of thick, unforgiving fog, and within that darkness, a death unfolds. A lone figure collapses on the pier. Unseen hands moving through the mist, leaving behind only silence and fear. As the villagers whisper and shadows tremble, Hercule Poirot arrives to confront the one enemy he cannot see, the killer hiding inside the fog. Settle in. Let the mist wrap around your imagination, for within it lies a secret only Poirot can unveil. Let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. The fog that swallowed the pier, the village of Sablewind, woke beneath a strange silence that morning, one that felt heavier than the fog itself. The mist had rolled in before dawn, thick as wool, smothering every sound until even the sea seemed afraid to breathe. The fishermen who normally gathered near the boats hesitated today, squinting into the pale, ghostly whiteness that concealed the pier dot. It wasn't an ordinary fog. It felt alive. Every lantern along Sablewind Pier glowed faintly, their light swallowed almost instantly by the swirling mist. Shapes shifted, appeared, and vanished like spirits wandering between worlds. Even the gulls were quiet, perched on wooden posts with their wings tucked in, as if unwilling to disturb whatever prowled beneath the fog's blanket dot in the upper window of the Seashell Inn. Mrs. Dunley stood hugging herself tightly, peering into the distance. "Lord save us," she whispered to no one. "Nothing good comes from a fog like this." She wasn't wrong. By 7:14 a.m., the scream shattered the silence. A fisherman rushing down the beach, Jonas Pike, had spotted something on the pier. He didn't dare approach at first, for the fog made the shape seem unreal, as though it hovered above the planks. But curiosity, terrifying curiosity, dragged him closer. He knelt. His breath hitched, and then he screamed. Word spread through the village faster than the fog could crawl, and soon a dozen villagers gathered near the start of the pier, whispering, trembling, refusing to go closer. "A body," Jonas gasped, his chest heaving. "There's a body out there, lying halfway to the end." "Who?" someone demanded. I don't know. Couldn't see the face. Fog's too thick." Mrs. Dunley crossed herself. "Not again. Please, not again." Because Sablewind had known death before. Strange deaths. Unexplained disappearances along the jagged coastline. But nothing like this. Nothing so brazen. Nothing placed directly on the pier, in plain sight, if only anyone could see clearly. The constabulary arrived moments later, accompanied by Inspector Graves, whose large boots thudded ominously on the soaked planks. He approached carefully, gripping the railing as the fog curled around him like cold fingers, and then a voice behind him spoke soft, precise, unmistakable. "Inspector Graves, you began without me." Graves turned, exasperation mixed with relief. "Hercule Poirot, how did I know you'd appear today?" Poirot stepped forward, immaculate even in the mist. His coat was perfectly buttoned, his mustache expertly shaped, and not a drop of fog clung to him, as if even the weather respected him. "Mon ami," Poirot said, "where there is a scream, there is a question. And where there is a question, the little gray cells must find an answer." Graves huffed. "Well, answer this. There's a dead man on the pier, and I can't see more than 3 feet in front of my face." Poirot smiled. "Then let us see with our minds, not our eyes." They walked slowly across the pier. Every step creaked. Every shadow shifted. Every breath they took felt stolen from the fog itself. About 20 paces in, the shape materialized, first like a smudge, then like a dark mass, then finally like a man lying on his side. One arm stretched out toward the sea. Poirot knelt beside the body, a man in his mid-40s. Well-dressed, coat damp from the fog, expression frozen in a mixture of shock and something else, fear. Or perhaps regret. Poirot touched the man's wrist. "Still warm," he murmured. "He has not been dead long." Graves rubbed his arms. "'Cause?" Poirot tilted his head. "No blood. No wound. No struggle. His shoes are clean. He did not run. His hands are unscathed. He did not fight." Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet, he died with terror in his eyes. Graves frowned. "Fright? A heart attack." Poirot lifted the man's hand. A faint dusting of white powder stained his fingertips. Poirot looked up sharply. None. Something else entirely. A soft clatter echoed behind them. Poirot and Graves turned. A lantern at the far end of the pier swayed violently, but there was no wind. Poirot stood abruptly. "Someone else is here." Graves drew his pistol. "Where?" Poirot listened. The fog shifted dot and then a shadow, human, barely visible, slipping between planks and railing as though made of mist. Poirot stepped forward. "Halt!" Graves shouted, but the figure vanished deeper into the fog. Poirot closed his eyes, thinking. "A killer who moves inside fog," he murmured. "Who leaves no trace. Who delivers death without a mark." He opened his eyes. "This is no ordinary murderer." Graves frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Poirot pointed to the white powder on the victim's hand. "A poison," he said softly. "One that kills instantly, even with the smallest touch." Graves stiffened. "So he was lured here? Touched something?" Someone shook his hand. Poirot nodded. "And the killer," he said grimly, "knew the fog would hide everything." The planks creaked behind them. Both men spun around. No one. Only fog drifting like silent breath. Poirot knelt again, examining the victim's coat pocket. A torn scrap of paper protruded. He pulled it out. 4 words were written in haste. "Meet me in fog." Poirot's mustache twitched sharply. "A rendezvous," he whispered. And the victim believed it was safe. Graves muttered, "Who would write that?" Poirot stood, a person who knew the fog better than anyone. He looked toward the village. Someone local. Poirot pointed at the scrap. "The handwriting is trembling." It was written by someone who knew death would follow. This was not a threat. It was a warning. A warning the victim didn't understand until it was too late. Suddenly, a second sound, a splash beneath the pier. Poirot rushed to the edge. Ripples spread outward through the dark water. Someone had just jumped or dropped something. Graves cursed. "We're dealing with someone bold." Poirot whispered, "No, Inspector." Someone desperate. And then it struck him. The fog wasn't hiding the killer. It was helping them. Chapter 2. The Man Who Walked into the Mist. The body was carried back through the fog with a strange, careful reverence. Even the constables, who had seen accidents at sea and fights at the tavern, walked slower than usual, as if the mist might suddenly decide to reclaim what it had given up. Inside the small stone building of the Sablewind Constabulary, the air felt too still. The body was laid out on a wooden table. Lamps burned low, casting a pale glow over the lifeless face. Inspector Graves folded his arms. "You recognize him, then?" The village doctor, a stiff gray-haired man named Dr. Harland, nodded grimly. "Felix Marlowe," he said. "He arrived in Sablewind 3 weeks ago. Lodging at the Seashell Inn. Told the villagers he was an accountant, come to work on some books for a client in the area." Poirot studied the man's features. Clean-shaven, with neatly trimmed hair and a lined brow. His hands were long and deft hands used to ink and paper, not rope and nets. "A stranger," Poirot murmured, "but not entirely without purpose." Graves grunted. "You think his books had something to do with this death?" Poirot smiled faintly. "In my experience, Inspector, where there are books, there are numbers. And where there are numbers, there are people who do not wish them to be checked too closely." Dr. Harlan cleared his throat. "There are no visible wounds. No head trauma. No signs of strangulation. Heart stopped as if switched off. I'll know more once I've examined him properly. But that powder on his fingers troubles me." Poirot nodded. "As it should." He took out a clean handkerchief and lightly wiped the white residue from Felix Marlowe's fingertips, folding it carefully. "A contact poison," Poirot said quietly. "Something placed on a rail, perhaps. Or on an object he picked up. He touches, he absorbs, he dies in moments. It is fast, discreet, and cowardly." Graves rubbed his temples. "And the fog helps. No one sees him fall. No one sees the killer leave." "Ah, but someone saw something," Poirot replied. "Already we know a shadow moved. A lantern swung. A splash was heard." He took the scrap of paper from his pocket and laid it on the table. "Meet M.E. in fog. Dr. Harland," Poirot asked. "Have you seen this handwriting before?" The doctor squinted. "Can't say that I have. But you may have better luck at the inn. Lydia Marsh sees more hands than any of us. Guest books, tabs, letters. Gossip." Graves sighed. "So we're off to the inn again." Poirot tucked the handkerchief and the note safely into his coat. "We, Inspector," he said. "We go where the stories are collected. Murder, you see, is rarely a single story. It is many small tales woven into one ugly pattern." As they stepped outside, the fog greeted them like a reluctant host. It had thinned slightly since dawn, but it still clung stubbornly to the pier, reluctant to release its secrets entirely. A fisherman standing nearby crossed himself as Poirot passed. Poirot's tone sharpened by a single degree. "Monsieur?" Calder exhaled roughly. "Maybe," he muttered. "We had a man in the village. Old sailor. Stayed mostly by the pier. Hands ruined by frost and rope burns. His writing. Shook like that. His name?" Poirot asked, Ronan Hale, Calder replied, though most just call him Old Ronan. And where, Poirot asked, might I find this old Ronan? Calder's answer came quietly, either at the pier, he said, or at the tavern. And if he wrote those notes, then he knew something he was too afraid to say out loud. Poirot's little gray cells sparked. A man who lives by the fog. A man whose hands shake. A man who warns, and yet never speaks. Merci, monsieur, Poirot said. You have been most helpful. As they left the lighthouse, the fog seemed to stir again below them, curling around the pier like a cat around its master's legs. Graves muttered, so now we're chasing an old drunk with shaky hands. Poirot shook his head gently. Non, Inspector. We are chasing the truth, and today it wears the hands of an old sailor. He looked down at the pier, just visible through the mist, and perhaps, Poirot whispered, the fog is not our enemy after all, but our witness. Chapter 4. The Sailor Who Feared the Fog. The tavern sat hunched against the wind like an old man shielding himself from the cold. Its wooden frame creaked as gusts pushed against its walls, and the sign, the Salted Gull, rocked back and forth in slow, weary circles. Even at mid-morning, the windows glowed with lamplight. Fog pressed against the glass like a living thing trying to peer inside. Poirot paused at the door. Inspector, he murmured, we enter not a place of drink, but a place of secrets. Let us step lightly. Graves pushed the door open with far less poetry. Inside, the tavern was warm but dim, the air heavy with the smell of roasted fish, damp coats, and aged timber. A few villagers sat at scattered tables, speaking in low voices. All conversation stopped when Poirot entered. They weren't expecting him, but they were expecting someone. Eyes drifted toward a shadowed corner near the back dot. An old man sat hunched over a chipped mug, his beard gray and wild, his face deeply lined. His clothes carried the smell of the sea salt rope, and a hint of loneliness. Old Ronan. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the mug. Not from drink, no. Poirot had seen drunks. These tremors were born of age, cold, and fear. Poirot approached slowly. Bonjour, Monsieur Ronan, he said softly. May we sit with you? Ronan's eyes pale blue, sharp beneath the weariness, lifted with a flicker of recognition. You're the detective, he rasped. The foreign one. Poirot smiled politely. I am many things, monsieur, but today I am here only to listen. Ronan snorted. People who listen are rare. People who want the truth? His eyes darted toward the window, where fog pulsed against the glass. Rarer still. Poirot removed the 2 notes from his pocket and set them on the table. Meet M.E. in fog. Don't go to the pier. Ronan's breath caught. His shoulders stiffened. Graves leaned forward. Recognize these? Ronan didn't touch the papers. Didn't even blink. Then, quietly, I wrote the second one. Poirot nodded once. And the first? Ronan's silence was answer enough. Why did you warn Felix Marlowe? Poirot asked gently. Ronan's trembling fingers tightened around his mug. Because I seen things on that pier at night. Things the fog hides. People who don't walk like fisherfolk, nor talk like they belong here. He swallowed hard. And that accountant. He wasn't just poking at numbers. He was poking at something bigger, something the fog feeds on. Poirot tilted his head. The fog, monsieur, is merely weather. The killer is a person. Ronan shook his head slowly. You don't understand. Sablewind fog. It's a blanket. Gives bad men cover to do worse things. And I've seen them. Shadow men. Passing things beneath the pier. Meeting boats with no names. Poirot exchanged a sharp glance with Graves. Ronan continued, his voice trembling. 3 nights ago, I heard them arguing beneath the pier. A voice raised angry, desperate. Another voice cold as the sea in winter. And something dropped into the water. Poirot leaned in. What time? Near 2 in the morning, Ronan replied. When decent folk sleep. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The same hour the unknown vessel arrived in the logbook. The same hour Felix began investigating discrepancies. And these men, Poirot asked quietly, did you see their faces? Ronan's jaw clenched. Fog don't show faces. Only shapes. But I heard names, or half of one. Poirot froze. Which? Ronan rubbed his forehead. A man shouted, You can't do this, sir, before he was cut off. Quick, like he knew he'd said too much. Poirot sat still as stone. Are the letter from the lighthouse records. The initial Calder had erased. The signature pushed into Felix's warnings, a single letter with many suspects. And yet somehow, in Sablewind, few enough to matter. Graves said, R could be anyone. Rowan Fisher. Robert Finch. Ronan here. Ronan slammed his mug down hard enough to rattle the table. I didn't kill that man. He growled. And you know it. You're just tossing names around like nets in the tide. Poirot raised a calming hand. None. No accusations. Only questions. He pointed to the second note. You wrote this. Why? Ronan sagged back in his seat, defeated. Because Felix was scared. He came to me a week ago, asking about boats that docked late. Men who dealt beneath the pier. He said someone found out he was asking too many questions. Someone. Dangerous. His voice lowered to a whisper. He said if he made it through the fog, he'd show me something. Something important. But he never came back. Poirot folded the notes carefully. You saw him leave last night? Poirot asked. Ronan nodded. He walked toward the pier. Fog was thick enough to choke a man. I shouted for him to stop. Told him no good comes from walking into fog with shadows waiting. His voice cracked. He waved. He smiled. And then he was gone. Poirot stood slowly. Merci. Monsieur Ronan, you have helped more than you know. Ronan's hand shot out, grabbing Poirot's sleeve with surprising strength. You'll find the man who did this, he rasped. But careful. Fog helps him. He knows it better than any of us. Poirot gently removed Ronan's grip. I do not fear the fog, he said with quiet resolve, because it cannot hide what the mind sees clearly. He turned toward the door. Graves hurried after him. Where now? Poirot stepped into the mist, his silhouette swallowed almost instantly. To the pier, Inspector, Poirot said. Where all threads return, Graves frowned. Why? There's nothing left there. Poirot's voice was soft, but certain. There is always something left, mon ami. Even footprints vanish for a reason. Chapter 5. Footprints that should not exist. The Chapter 5. Footprints that should not exist. Thumbprints that should not exist. The fog had begun to thin when Poirot and Inspector Graves reached the start of Sablewind Pier again. The sun fought faintly behind layers of mist, creating a strange silvery glow over the wooden planks. It gave the pier an otherworldly appearance, less a structure, more a ghost lingering above the restless water. Poirot stopped at the entrance. "Inspector," he murmured, "look closely. What is different now from earlier this morning?" Graves squinted. "Well, the fog's lighter." Poirot raised a finger. "Yes, but not that." Graves scanned the pier again, his boots scraping the ground. Then he saw it. Footprints. Not the chaotic prints from villagers and constables earlier. Not the scuff marks from when the body was moved. These were new, fresh, wet, leading toward the far end of the pier. And most importantly, they led only one way. There were no returning footprints. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Someone walked onto the pier after the body was removed. Graves stiffened and didn't walk off. Poirot nodded. "Which means they left another way." Graves stared blankly before realization hit him hard. "The water," he breathed. Poirot tapped his temple. "'Twas been, Inspector." The killer returned to the pier, but not by land. They came from below. Graves looked down at the restless tide. A boat? A hidden dinghy? Poirot crouched to inspect the footprints. They were precise, evenly spaced, made by a person walking with confidence, not the staggering of a drunk or the panic of a fugitive. These prints, Poirot said softly, belonged to someone accustomed to the pier at night. He stood and looked toward the sea, and someone who trusts the fog to cover their movements. Graves muttered, "Fog again. Everything goes back to that cursed fog." Poirot smiled faintly. "Or perhaps, Inspector, everything goes back to those who hide within it." He walked further down the pier until he reached the spot where Felix Marlowe had collapsed. The wood was still damp, but the indent where the body had lain was visible. Poirot knelt. "Notice," he said. "The footprints stopped 5 feet before this point." Graves leaned over. "So they didn't approach the body?" Poirot touched the wood lightly. "No, they stood and watched." "A witness? Or the killer returning to confirm death?" He pointed to a faint impression near the railing, a handprint, smeared by moisture. "Someone touched the railing," Poirot whispered. "Someone who leaned to look down." Graves' eyes followed the railing to the water below. What were they looking for? Poirot answered without hesitation, "Something they dropped." Graves tensed. "The poison?" Poirot nodded slowly. "A vial, perhaps. Or container. Something that carried the deadly substance." They scanned the water. But any small object would have been swept away by the tide. Poirot stood. "But they were careless," he murmured. "They left an impression," he murmured. "They left an impression." Graves frowned. "What impression?" Poirot pointed to the pattern left in the railing's moisture. A glove, Poirot said. Not wool, not fisherman's leather. A fine glove, smooth, expensive. Graves blinked. Someone wealthy? Poirot shook his head. Not wealthy, necessarily, but someone who values concealment more than comfort. He looked back at this single line of footprints. Someone who does not come from the sea, but used it tonight. A figure approached them from behind. Breathless dot, it was Lydia Marsh from the inn. "Mr. Poirot," she gasped. "You need to come, quickly." Poirot turned briskly. "What has happened?" "It's Calder the lighthouse keeper," she said, voice trembling. "He's missing. His lighthouse door is open, and the villagers say someone saw a boat leaving the cove an hour ago." Poirot exchanged a look with Graves. "A boat?" Graves asked. "Who saw it?" "Old Ronan," Lydia whispered. "He said he saw a rowing boat, no lantern, no sound, just drifting away into the fog." Poirot's mind sharpened instantly. "Inspector," he said, "the footprints, the boat, the missing man, these are not coincidences. Someone has returned to remove a loose thread." Graves frowned. "You think Calder was involved?" Poirot lifted a hand. "I think Calder knew something dangerous. Enough that the killer must silence him." He turned to Lydia. "Madame, did Calder seem frightened last night?" She hesitated. "Not frightened, but worried. He drank more than usual, and when Felix left, Calder followed him outside." Poirot's mustache twitched. "Followed him?" "Yes," Lydia said. "Calder stepped out only a minute after Felix. I saw them both go toward the pier." Poirot's eyes flashed. "Inspector, Calder was on the pier last night." Graves' jaw dropped. "So he might have seen the killer." Poirot nodded. "And now the killer believes he must be silenced. We must go to the lighthouse, immediately." Chapter 6. The empty lighthouse. The steps to Sablewind Lighthouse felt steeper than before. Clouds sat low over the sea, pressing the last of the fog down toward the water. From the cliff path, the pier looked like a thin, dark scar over the shimmering gray surface. The lighthouse itself loomed ahead, silent, pale, and watchful. The door was not just unlocked. It was open. It creaked softly with each gust of wind, as if the building were breathing. Inspector Graves swore under his breath. "That's not a good sign." Poirot said nothing. He pushed the door gently aside with 2 fingers, his eyes immediately taking stock of the room. The main chamber of the lighthouse, where they had spoken with Calder earlier, was in disarray. A chair lay overturned. One of the oil lamps had been knocked to the floor, its glass cracked but not shattered. A coat that had hung on a nail near the door was missing, and on the floor, near the table with the logbook, a mug lay on its side, a dark stain of spilled tea beneath it. "Struggle," Graves muttered. Poirot took a slow breath. "Or a man surprised." "Perhaps both." He moved toward the logbook. The thick leather spine was still there, but when Poirot opened it, his mouth tightened. Several pages had been torn cleanly out. "Mon Dieu," he murmured. "Our killer is tiding his past." Graves leaned over his shoulder. "You think Calder did this?" "No, Poirot said immediately. The man who tears pages now is the same who feared those pages being seen. He turned his head, examining the room again. Do you notice, Inspector? Poirot said softly. There is no blood. No sign of a body dragged. No coat dropped in haste. Calder is not dead. Graves raised a brow. You're sure? Poirot's gaze flicked to the lamp on the floor. The wick has been recently trimmed, he said. Someone did so no more than an hour ago. And yet no one has lit it since. Our keeper was interrupted, not removed. A faint sound drifted from below, not the sea, not the wind. A muffled thump. Poirot's head snapped toward the spiral staircase, leading downwards to the storage level, and the narrow door that opened out toward the rocks and cove below. Inspector, he said sharply, we are not alone in this lighthouse. They descended carefully. The stone steps were narrow, damp, and dimly lit by what little daylight seeped in through tiny porthole windows. Another sound. A strained, muffled attempt at speech. Graves quickened his pace. Poirot laid a warning hand on the inspector's arm. Slowly, he whispered, we do not know what awaits us. At the base of the stairs, a small corridor branched off to a storage room. The door was closed. From behind it came a dull, persistent scraping, and a stifled grunt. Graves reached for the handle. Poirot shook his head once. Then, quietly, he placed his palm against the wood. No footsteps retreating, he murmured. Only struggle. Proceed, Inspector. Graves threw the door open. Inside, amid coils of rope and crates of oil tins, lay Calder Wexley tied to a support beam, his wrists bound behind him. A gag tied so tightly across his mouth it had bitten into the skin. Calder's eyes flashed with fierce, humiliated rage. Graves rushed forward, pulling the gag free. Poirot knelt and began loosening the knots at his wrists with careful, precise fingers. Easy, monsieur, Poirot said. You have had a difficult morning, I think. Calder spat to the side, sucking in a proper breath. Difficult? He rasped. He tried to kill me. Who? Graves demanded. Name. Calder winced as circulation returned to his hands. He came by boat quiet as a rat in the tide. I heard the knock. Thought it was you, Inspector. Or the boy from the harbor. Instead, I opened the door and found the devil himself. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Describe this devil, if you please. Calder's expression darkened. You've seen him. We all have. He's been playing this village like a fiddle for years, hiding behind generosity, charity, and ledgers. Which man? Graves snapped. Calder stared straight at Poirot as he answered. Reginald Crowe, he said. Your respectable shipping agent. The man who manages freight for half this coastline. The name settled in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Poirot nodded slowly. Ah, he murmured. Yes, the man with the neat gloves and quiet shoes. Always at the harbor, but never with wet hands. Calder's brows furrowed. You knew? I suspected, Poirot corrected. Now I know, Graves cursed. Crowe? He's been in every meeting about harbor safety, every discussion about tariffs. He gave money to repair the church roof. Poirot's mustache lifted at the corners. "With smuggled funds, I suspect. It is always the way with such men. They commit crimes in darkness and buy virtue in daylight." He turned back to Calder. "What happened when Crow arrived?" he asked. Calder swallowed. "He stormed in like he owned the place," the keeper said. "Slammed the door. Asked if I still had Marlowe's notes. Said the accountant had been sloppier than expected, and that if anyone else saw what was written, things would go badly for both of us." "Both?" Poirot echoed. Calder looked away. "He's been paying me, all right. To omit certain entries. To write others. Wrongly. Nameless vessels. Wrong times. Ships that never docked, on paper at least. I told myself it was harmless. Just ink." He closed his eyes briefly, but Felix saw the pattern. He realized the numbers didn't match the cargo declared at various ports. He came to me asking questions. I panicked. I told Crow. Graves clenched his jaw. So Crow knew Felix was closing in on him. Calder nodded. He smiled when I told him. Said, "Accountants are useful until they start counting the wrong things." Poirot frowned. "And last night?" "Last night," Calder said quietly, "Crow told me Felix would receive an invitation. A letter suggesting a meeting at the pier. He said if Felix listened, things could be resolved. Resolved with poison." Poirot murmured. Calder's single quotes gaze dropped. "I didn't know it would be that. I thought, God help me, I thought Crow meant a bribe or a threat. I didn't realize until I saw the body being carried this morning." Graves stepped closer, fist tightening. "You saw it and didn't speak?" "I was afraid." Calder snapped. "He came back today. He knew the tide of suspicion would turn. He demanded any pages Felix had taken from my logs. He tore out the rest himself. When I said I wouldn't lie anymore, he knocked me down, dragged me here, and tied me up. Said if I made a sound before nightfall, I'd be found floating in the cove." Poirot nodded grimly. "A boat was seen leaving the cove," he said. "Old Ronan saw it." Calder let out a humorless laugh. "Then Crow thinks he's safe. He'll wait until the fog returns tonight to leave properly. That's what he always does. Fog is his ally. It hides his shipments. And now it hides his murder." Poirot rose. "None," he said softly. "Tonight, the fog will turn its back on him." Graves frowned. "What are you planning?" Poirot's eyes shone with a quiet, ferocious light. "We will give Monsieur Crow the one thing he does not expect," he replied. "A meeting at the pier, where the fog is no longer his accomplice, but his judge. The fog is no longer his accomplice, but his judge." Chapter 7. A trap set in the mist by late evening. The fog returned to Sablewind Pier like an old conspirator summoned for one last crime. It rolled in from the sea, soft and thick, wrapping itself around the wooden beams and lanterns. The villagers stayed inside their homes, shutters latched, lamps low. Word had spread without names, without details, that something was coming to a head. Hercule Poirot stood at the near end of the pier, his figure a dark, steady shape in the pale murk. Beside him, Inspector Graves shifted impatiently, hand resting on his holstered pistol. "I still don't like this," Graves muttered. "Letting a killer move through the fog while we stand out here like bait." Poirot smiled faintly. "We are bait, Inspector. Very expensive bait. But you see, Crow is a man of habit. He uses the fog to hide his comings and goings. Tonight, he believes he will do so one last time." Graves frowned. "You're sure he'll come?" Poirot lifted his chin slightly. "I left Calder where Crow expects him to be," he said. "Not bound anon, but resting helpless in the lighthouse. I asked Calder to light the lamp only once Crow arrives. A signal. And before that, I arranged for a rumor to reach the right ears." "What rumor?" Graves asked. "That Calder spoke," Poirot replied. "That he told us everything. That he gave us names, routes, records." Graves let out a low whistle. "So if Crow hears that, he must act," Poirot finished. "Either to flee or to silence one last man." Graves glanced warily into the dark. "And you think he'll choose silence?" he said. Poirot nodded. "Crow is not yet ready to abandon his empire. Men like him are very proud. They believe themselves invincible." The wind shifted, carrying a faint sound. The rhythmic splash of oars. Graves straightened. "Boat." Poirot's eyes glinted. "Right on schedule." A faint, dark shape emerged from the fog to their right, low to the water, moving with frightening quiet. No lantern. No creak of wood. Only the soft dip and pull of the oars. The boat did not come to the pier stairs. It slipped beneath it, toward the cove side support pillars. Poirot turned. "Under the pier," he murmured. "As always." Graves swore under his breath and began to move. Poirot caught his arm. "Non, wait." Moments later, the tiny, distant beacon at the lighthouse sparked to life one brief flare. Then dimmed. "The lamp was lit once," Poirot said. "Crow has arrived." Graves' jaw clenched. "So while we're up here, he's going for Calder." Poirot shook his head slowly. "Non, Inspector. Crow expects us to be searching houses, questioning villagers. He believes Calder is alone." Poirot turned and walked toward the far end of the pier. "Come," he said softly. "Let us welcome our guest." They moved along the planks, the fog thickening around them. Lanterns overhead swung with each gust, their light barely cutting a small circle through the white. Near the final stretch of the pier, Poirot stopped. "Here," he said. Graves listened. At first, only the creak of wood and rush of tide answered. Then a faint clink, metal against wood. The sound of someone tying a boat to the hidden lower rung. Footsteps followed, soft, deliberate footsteps rising from the lower ladder onto the pier itself. Graves' hand slid toward his pistol. A shadow appeared in the fog, coalescing slowly into the outline of a tall, lean man in a long coat. He moved with the careful confidence of someone who had walked this path many times without being seen. Reginald Crow. His gloved hands adjusted his collar. The fog curled around him as if reluctant to let him go. He did not see Poirot and Graves. Not yet. His attention was fixed on the lighthouse beyond. And whatever he intended to do there, Poirot stepped forward into the thin circle of light. "Bonsoir, Monsieur Crow." Crow stopped dead. even through the fog. Poirot could see his jaw tighten. "This is an odd place for a stroll, Mr. Poirot," Crow said slowly. His voice was smooth, controlled. "Fog like this isn't safe for visitors." Poirot smiled. "For some, monsieur. For others, it is. Familiar territory." Graves moved into view beside Poirot. "You took your time," he said grimly. Crow's eyes flicked between them. "Inspector Graves, I wasn't aware I required your permission to walk to the lighthouse." "No," Graves replied. "Just to murder people on the pier." Crow's lips curled faintly. "Big words. Small evidence." Poirot clasped his hands lightly over his chest. "Let us test that, shall we?" He said, "On the night of Felix Marlowe's death, you sent him a letter. Meet me in fog. You used the weather you love so dearly to hide your steps. You came by boat, as you did tonight, tied it beneath the pier, and ascended unseen. You greeted him as a business partner. You offered him a deal, and while he thought, while he hesitated, you led him to the rail there." Poirot pointed toward the spot where the faint glove impression had once marked the damp wood. "And there he touched what you had prepared." Crow's voice was carefully bored. "And what would that be?" "A poison," Poirot answered softly. "Coated onto the rail itself, in a place you knew his hand would rest, odorless, fast, impossible to distinguish from a sudden collapse." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "You wore gloves, of course." "As you always do." Crow's gaze dropped briefly, almost involuntarily, to his hands. Poirot saw it. "And when he fell," Poirot continued, "you stepped back into the fog. You went down the ladder, loosed your boat, and slipped away beneath the pier." Graves took a breath as if to charge forward. But Poirot lifted a finger. "Later," Poirot went on, "you realized something had gone wrong. The body had been found. The village was whispering. So you returned from the sea after dawn to recheck the scene, to see if any trace remained. That is when you left the one-way footprints. That is when you leaned on the rail once more, watching the constables work. You thought the fog would hide you." Crow's eyes had narrowed to slits. "You're very imaginative, Mr. Poirot," he said. "But you forget something. I have no reason to kill this man. I barely knew him." Poirot's voice softened. "Ah, but you knew his employer." Crow's jaw clenched. "Felix Marlowe," Poirot said, "was hired by an insurance firm to investigate discrepancies in shipping manifests. Ships that docked but did not declare cargo. Cargo that was insured but never arrived on paper, and whose name appeared across those documents as the supervising agent of record." Silence. Poirot supplied the answer himself. Reginald Crow. Graves stepped closer. "We have copies of those records now, from Marlowe's rooms, along with notes that mention night arrivals and fog-logged boats tied to your accounts." Crow's smooth facade cracked. "Lies," he spat. "Conclusions drawn by a man out of his depth." "None," Poirot said sharply. "Drawn by a man who drowned in your fog." He took a step forward. "And when you realized Calder might break, you returned today. By sea. You forced your way into the lighthouse, tore out the damning log pages, tried to frighten him silent. But even then, you did not dare kill him. Not yet. Too risky. Too many eyes. Too much talk. Poirot paused. So you plan to return tonight, under the cover of fog, to finish what you began. He spread his hands, and here you are, monsieur. For the first time. Crow's composure shattered completely. This is absurd, he snapped. You have no witnesses. Poirot's expression softened. On the contrary, he said. I have 3. He turned his head slightly, from the darkness further back on the pier. An older, cracked voice called, I saw your boat. Crow. Old Ronan stepped into the edge of the lantern circle, his weathered face grim. And I heard your voice that night beneath the pier, he said. You can't do this, he shouted, before you silenced him. Calder emerged next, coat thrown over his shoulders, a bandage around one wrist. You told me it was harmless, Calder said hoarsely. That no one would be hurt. You lied. Crow's eyes flashed wildly between them. And our final witness, Poirot added softly, is not a man at all. He pointed toward the lighthouse. The logbook may be missing pages, but it still bears your handwriting where you signed off on unusual traffic. And Felix Marlowe left behind copies of entries he made while he examined it. He was a cautious man, monsieur. He photographed what he feared would disappear. Crow took an involuntary step back. His heel hit the railing dot beyond it. Only fog and the dark sea. Inspector Graves drew his pistol fully now. Reginald Crow, he said, voice firm. You are under arrest for the murder of Felix Marlowe and for your part in a smuggling operation using this harbor. For a heartbeat. Crow weighed his options. Fog behind him. Justice before him. His eyes darted once toward the shadow beneath, the pier where his boat waited. Poirot shook his head gently. The fog cannot save you tonight, he said. It has already spoken. Crow's shoulders sagged. The fight left him with a single exhalation. He held out his hands. Graves stepped forward, binding them with practiced efficiency. As the inspector led him back along the pier, Crow glanced back at Poirot, hatred and reluctant respect warring in his eyes. You used my own fog against me, he said bitterly. Poirot's mustache twitched. Non, monsieur, he replied. You did that yourself. You wrapped your crimes in mist and assumed no one would ever see through it. But murder, you see. He looked out toward the sea, where the fog was finally beginning to thin. As a way of clearing the air. As a way of clearing the air. Chapter 8. The Man Who Tried to Own the Fog. The constabulary had never felt so full. Not of people. There were only a handful inside, but of tension. Heavy, unmoving tension that seemed to settle into the cracks of the stone walls and the grain of the wooden desk. Reginald Crow sat on a hard chair in the center of the room, wrists bound, coat removed. Without his polished exterior, no gloves, no carefully arranged scarf, he looked somehow smaller. Not weak, but less untouchable. Inspector Graves stood near the door, arms folded, jaw clenched tight. Old Ronan, after giving his statement, sat on a bench along the wall, hat in his hands. Calder leaned against a post, wrist bandaged. Expression tired but resolved. Poirot moved quietly around Crow. As if examining a specimen, on the desk lay several items: a pair of fine leather gloves, faintly stained at the fingertips, a small glass vial, its interior coated with a chalky residue, copies of shipping manifests, bearing Crow's signature, Felix Marlowe's notebook, full of meticulous scribbles and dates. Crow's gaze remained fixed straight ahead. "You have made a mistake," he said at last, voice cold. "A grave one. I have influence, Inspector. Friends in the city. This little drama of yours will not hold." Graves snorted. "Murder looks very bad on wealthy friends' reports." Poirot lifted the glass vial delicately with a handkerchief. "You know this, monsieur?" Crow's eyes flicked toward it, then away. "I do not." Poirot smiled faintly, curious. It was found beneath the pier ladder, wedged between two beams. Still wet when the constable retrieved it. He tilted the vial, watching the powder catch the light. "Dr. Harlan has already tested the residue. A fast-acting toxin absorbed through the skin." He looked down at Crow's gloves. "And these," Poirot continued, "bear faint traces of the same substance at the tips. You wiped them, oui, but not well enough." Crow's jaw twitched. "Circumstantial." "Oh, but we are not finished, monsieur," Poirot said gently. He opened Felix's notebook and turned it toward Crow. "Felix Marlowe, he said, was a careful man. He did not trust that everyone he met was honest. See here, 2 weeks ago he wrote, 'Crow deflects questions. Crow insists on fog night shipments only. Pattern smells bad.' He flipped a few pages. And here, 'If anything happens to me, it will be because I counted what was meant to remain uncounted.'" Crow's lips curled briefly, like a man wanting to scoff but finding no breath for it. Poirot closed the notebook. "You see, monsieur, Felix had already placed you at the center of his investigation. He discovered that ships you managed arrived with no proper declaration. Sometimes at 2 in the morning, sometimes at 4. Always when fog rolled in and no one was watching, except perhaps a lonely lighthouse keeper and an old sailor who listened too closely." Ronan lifted his head at that. Calder looked away. "You told yourself," Poirot went on, "that you were only redirecting opportunity, moving goods without tax, a little smuggling, a little bribery. And then one day a man with numbers appeared, a man who could trace patterns you assumed invisible." Crow's voice dropped to a low growl. "He could have walked away. I offered him money." Poirot nodded once. "Oui, you did. First a payoff, then a warning. And finally," he touched the vial again, "a solution." Crow's eyes flashed. "He chose to fight. I simply ended the fight with a nudge." Ronan muttered, "You ended a man's life on this pier you've been bleeding for years." Crow shot him a cold look. "You drank off my shipments for years, old man. Don't grow a conscience now." Ronan's jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. Doc Graves stepped forward. "Why poison? Why not just push him into the sea, like all the stories say?" Crow tilted his head. "Because drowning leaves questions, bruises, broken bones. Panic. A man who collapses with a hand to his chest in thick fog?" He shrugged. An unfortunate attack. That was the beauty of it. No marks. Poirot's gaze sharpened. It was not beauty, monsieur. It was cowardice. Silence followed. Poirot stepped closer, lowering his voice. You returned to the scene this morning to ensure nothing incriminating remained. You did not account for three things: the tide failing to carry away the vial, the lighthouse keeper realizing he had helped a devil, and an old sailor who, for once, chose to speak instead of drown his fear. Crow's stare met Poirot's. And you, he said slowly, the foreigner who walks like he's never been touched by cold, and yet somehow smells it on everyone else. Poirot smiled slightly. It is not the cold I smell, monsieur. It is the guilt. Graves moved behind Crow, hand resting on his shoulder. You'll be transferred to the city prison in the morning, the inspector said. You can test your influence against a murder charge all you like there. Crow's mask finally cracked. For a moment, he looked simply tired. A man who had spent too long believing himself untouchable, now realizing the world was, after all, quite capable of reaching him. Poirot turned away. The fog, he said quietly, is no longer yours. Chapter 9. The room above the Inn Felix Marlowe's room at the Seashell Inn was small, neat, and full of unfinished thoughts. A suitcase sat open on the bed, half-packed with folded shirts and papers. On the small writing desk by the window lay a fountain pen, a bottle of ink, and several loose sheets covered in tidy angular handwriting. The window itself was beaded with moisture, fog pressing faintly against the glass like a curious face. Lydia Marsh stood in the doorway as Poirot moved slowly around the room. I didn't want to touch anything, she said quietly. Felt wrong. Like he might walk back in and tell me to clear it all away himself. Poirot nodded. You did well, madame. He picked up one of the papers. To be sent, he read aloud. To the attention of Mr. Harrow, Senior Claims Auditor. North and Tarrington Assurance minus urgent. He scanned the lines quickly. The letter outlined Felix's suspicions about falsified shipping reports, consistent discrepancies, and one name circling every anomaly. Reginald Crow. Felix had written that he was close to, confirming physical evidence, and that he believed someone has realized. I am looking in the wrong places on purpose. Poirot folded the page. Gently. He was going to send this. Lydia whispered. Poirot glanced at the addressed but unsealed envelope beside it. Oui, he said softly. And I think he was killed before he could do so. Lydia stepped into the room, wringing a cloth between her hands. Mr. Poirot. Do they know? His people? That he's gone? Poirot looked at the empty suitcase, at the stillness of the room. Soon, he said. Inspector Graves will send word through the proper channels. I will also enclose this letter. The firm must know how brave he was. Lydia swallowed hard. Brave, she repeated. I thought he looked scared. Poirot smiled gently. Courage, madame, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act in spite of it. She exhaled slowly. He asked me, the night before last, if I thought Sablewind was a safe place. I told him, depends who you're running from. He laughed, but not with his eyes. Poirot turned to the small knit stand. On it lay a pocket watch, stopped, a small worn book of poetry, and a photograph of Felix shaking hands with two older people likely his parents. Poirot straightened the photograph with a small, respectful gesture. "He died far from them," Lydia murmured. "Yes," Poirot said softly, "but not unnoticed, nor unmourned." They left the room in silence. Downstairs, the common room of the inn was quieter than usual. Old Ronan sat in his usual corner, but his mug remained mostly full. Calder, freshly cleaned up, sat at a table near the fire, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. Graves stood by the bar, speaking quietly with a constable. Poirot descended the stairs, and for a moment all faces turned toward him. "Well?" Ronan asked roughly. "Crow stays caught?" Poirot nodded. He will not walk your pier again." Ronan looked down into his drink. "Then I'll drink to someone else for once," he muttered. Calder rose, walking over to Poirot with slow, heavy steps. "I told them everything," the lighthouse keeper said. "About the falsified logs, the late-night vessels, the money. I can't undo it, but I can at least stop lying." Poirot studied him. "Guilt is a weight, monsieur," he said gently. "Some drown under it. Others learn to carry it until it fades." Calder shook his head. "Can't say I deserve that mercy." Poirot shrugged slightly. "Mercy is rarely about deserving. It is about what comes next." Lydia stepped forward then, wiping her hands on her apron. "What comes next, Mr. Poirot?" she asked. "For the village, I mean. For the pier." Poirot looked toward the door, where a thin line of daylight was visible at the bottom, fog slowly lifting beyond it. "Now," he said, "Sablewind must learn to stand without its shadows. No more nameless ships. No more hidden cargo. No more men who use the fog as a curtain." He smiled faintly. "The pier will still be dangerous, because the sea is never truly safe. But the danger will be honest. Waves, storms, weather." His eyes softened. "Not the kind of danger that wears gloves and smiles at the church bazaar." There was a quiet murmur of agreement. Poirot reached into his coat and placed Felix's finished letter, now sealed, into Graves' hand. "Have this sent," he said. "Let the firm know their man did not die for nothing." Graves nodded. "I'll see to it." Poirot turned to the window. Outside, the fog was finally, slowly starting to thin. Chapter 10. When the fog finally lifts by the next morning, Sablewind Pier looked almost ordinary again. The planks were still damp, but no longer treacherously slick. The fog had retreated to a light, lingering haze hovering above the water. Gulls cried overhead, back to their usual squabbling. Fishermen moved more freely, voices louder, shoulders less drawn. Life, as it always does, was attempting to resume. Poirot stood near the beginning of the pier, suitcase in hand, watching as a boy coiled a rope and an older man checked the nets. The pier did not feel cleansed exactly, but it no longer hummed with something hidden. Inspector Graves approached, coat flapping slightly in the breeze. "Carriage will be ready in 10 minutes, he said. "Train after that." "You sure you don't want to stay?" I'm certain the villagers would name a bench after you. Poirot's lips curved. Non. A bench would suggest I wish to sit. But Hercule Poirot is always moving, Inspector. There are always more questions in the world. Graves chuckled. I'll miss your speeches. He sobered after a moment. You know, he said, I used to think fog was just fog, weather, inconvenience. Now I'll never look at it the same way again. Poirot nodded slowly. Fog, he said, is like fear. It makes everything seem blurred. It hides familiar things, makes them strange. But fear and fog share another trait, Inspector. Graves raised a brow. What's that? They both lift, Poirot replied. If you are patient. If you stand still and think instead of running blindly. Graves looked out toward the water. Do you think Crow started as a bad man? He asked. Or just slid into it? Poirot considered the question. Most men, he said, do not begin with murder in their hearts. They begin with excuses. Just this once, just a small lie, just this one night in the fog, and then one day, monsieur, they look back and realize they are no longer walking on the pier, they are sinking beneath it. Graves exhaled. And Felix? He asked, what would you call him? Poirot's gaze followed a small fishing boat pushing away from the dock. A man who counted honestly, he said softly. In a world where many prefer their sums blurred. He smiled faintly. I think he would be pleased to know the fog did not keep his truth buried. Footsteps approached behind them. Lydia, Ronan, and Calder stood a few paces away. We wanted to see you off, Lydia said. People don't usually come here, fix everything, and then disappear overnight. Poirot inclined his head. I did not fix everything, madame, he said. I merely pulled one weed from a crowded garden. The tending that is now your task. Ronan grunted. We'll watch the pier differently now. Can't promise we'll stop grumbling, but we'll see more than we pretend not to see. Calder added quietly, the lighthouse logs will be clean from now on. Word of honor. I'll record every ship, named or not. Poirot's mustache twitched in approval. Bon, Sablewind will be a little less foggy in the mind. Then, even if the weather does not cooperate. Graves checked his pocket watch. Time. The carriage rattled up along the cobbled road. Driver tipping his hat. Poirot turned toward the pier one last time. The place where Felix had fallen was just another stretch of boards now indistinguishable to the casual eye. But Poirot saw it clearly. He always would. He lifted his hat slightly, a small, private gesture of respect. Au revoir, Monsieur Marlowe, he murmured. Your work is done. The little gray cells will take it from here. He climbed into the carriage as it rolled away from Sablewind Village. The morning sun finally broke fully through the thinning clouds. A shaft of light fell across the water, turning the surface from dull gray to glimmering silver. Graves watched as the carriage shrank into the distance. Beside him, Lydia whispered, Think we'll ever see him again. Ronan snorted. Hope not. Means things stayed quiet. Calder gave a small, tired smile. The fog will come back, he said. But now we know better than to trust what hides inside it. Down at the pier, a boy laughed as he slipped on a wet plank and caught himself. An older man scolded him, then ruffled his hair. Life went on. The sea breathed, and the fog, for now, kept its distance. Somewhere on the road beyond, Hercule Poirot leaned back in the carriage seat, fingers resting lightly together, eyes closing, not in sleep, but in thought that there would be another village, another death, another veil to lift. But Sablewind Pier, at least, had been granted a rare gift, a murder that did not vanish into the mist.